A Jewish scholar called Daniel Boyarin recounts an amusing anecdote. Every day for 30 years, a man drove a wheelbarrow full of sand across the Tijuana border into the U.S. The customs inspector dug through the sand each morning during a thorough search, but could never find any contraband. But he was convinced he was dealing with a smuggler. On the day the agent retired from service, he asked the man to be straight up and honest. What was he smuggling, and how was he able to do so? Wheelbarrows, of course, the man said. I know. Daniel Boyarin isn't going to get any comedy specials on Netflix, and this joke probably rates even below dad jokes. But it does show us something. How we interpret something is often skewed based on our preconceived biases. The agent didn't spot the contraband because he did not consider that the wheelbarrow was the thing being smuggled. He was so convinced the contraband was in the sand, he never stopped to consider the wheelbarrow. So too, the lines between what made someone a Jew and what made someone a Christian in the very early days of the church was rather porous and sometimes confusing. It depended on where you looked. Even Christians themselves did not always realize if they were Jews living with the knowledge of fulfillment or a new religion. It's sort of like the old optical illusion of the duck or the rabbit. Which one do you see? And while this problem of identity gets solved rather early on, it also reveals that from the earliest days after Christ's ascension, Christianity needed to explain to outsiders who and what it really was. And it also means that Christianity never began completely as its own thing. It was always dependent on Judaism on the one hand and defined by Gentile culture on the other. In this lecture, we want to look at the context of the early church and what normal Christians faced or could expect to face in their lives during this time of identity formation. This is the background in which the fathers, almost all of whom were pastors, had to preach and live within before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This was the setting in which moms, dads, siblings, neighbors, and friends lived out their faith. If you were a Christian back then, this was your story. To make our first observation, I want you to think of a donut. Now, what do we call the space in the middle of a donut? A donut hole, right? We call it a donut hole, of course, but the problem is a donut hole doesn't actually exist. It's just the space where the donut is not. In other words, and here's the big point, a donut hole is a term that can only be defined through something else, in this case, a donut. Well, the term Christian was at first under debate because it was not clear if it was a word that functioned more like donut, a real thing, or donut hole. You see, some people thought that Christianity was just another form of Judaism, making it more like a donut hole, because it would have to exist through Judaism, be defined through Judaism. In other words, calling someone a Christian just meant calling them something like a Pharisee or a Sadducee or an Essene, types of Jews, or today something like Orthodox or Reformed Jews. But others began to think of Christianity as closer to how donut works. That is, it's its own thing, and it needn't be seen or defined through Judaism. It was distinct. Why is this important? Because as the great patristic scholar Robert Louis Wilkins says, quote, "From the beginning, Christians were conscious of the other," end quote. That is, from the start, Christianity was always defined or in interaction with and through others by Jews on the one hand, you could read the biblical book of Galatians to see that, or by Romans on the other, who saw Christianity early on as unpatriotic and strange. And this meant that Christianity from the start never had to grow up as a singularly cultural, ethnic, or socioeconomic religion. It was always growing up aware of the others who critiqued it, challenged it, differed from it, but also who contributed to its expression. Christianity birthed from Judaism, but it made strange claims that Jews could not tolerate. These mostly came down to the observations of Jewish laws and rituals. From even as early as in the New Testament, Christians did not follow kosher and all the observations of other Jewish laws. This meant that Jewish rabbis and teachers often did not see them as Jews. Before the robust evangelism of the Gentiles by Paul, many Christians just thought of themselves as Jews to whom the revelation of the Messiah had come. They thought they were good Jews living in the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. They thought they were in a new age of Judaism. But Jewish leadership often did not agree. They saw how Christians didn't observe kosher and the law, and how Christians called Jesus Lord, which for them clearly made Christianity its own thing and not to be defined through Judaism. And then on the other side were the Romans. They found Christianity unpatriotic and strange for reasons we'll talk about in the next lecture. For them, Christianity was deviant and dangerous to the public good because it was unpatriotic. But also, it was for them certainly false. The Romans thought Christianity was false because it was new. It didn't have the right to make cosmic claims to truth because it didn't exist just a few years ago. Its newness was proof of its falsity. Christians had to deal with these others who rejected them and did not let them sit comfortably in any pre-established categories. Some of the earliest Christian writings we'll encounter in this course deal with these two groups and how they interact with Christians. But why does this matter? Because if you were a Christian back then, even if you never faced persecution, you had to make sacrifices, emotional, financial, psychological, and existential. And once you hear the reasons, you will understand why many of the first converts were poor, because they had less to lose. So the first one, emotional. To be an early Christian meant abandoning something else. To every modern-day convert from Islam, Buddhism, or atheism today, they know what it's like to convert to Christianity, and it often means losing many of the things that support and give or gave meaning to one's life. To become a Christian was to abandon, in many cases, generations and centuries of Jewish faith or Roman privilege. It could mean alienation from your neighbors, and in the small villages and neighborhoods of the ancient world, being a pariah in your own town. Just like Jesus said, families turned on each other, parents were grieved and hurt, and separations, divisions, and public shaming took place. The emotional toll, the sacrifice, was enormous. Then there was financial. Becoming a Christian was not a good investment strategy. Some Christians felt compelled to close their shops, for example, like if their shop made idols or sold supplies to pagan temples. But others faced blacklisting from pagans or Jews. And in addition, the young church needed money to support the mission, church plants, and the care and support of widows and orphans. Converting to Christianity was expensive. And then there was psychological issues. The church family came to replace actual families, since those families were often fractured or divided over the new faith. Doubt and second-guessing, especially in the face of persecutions, caused tremendous mental stress. Public and private shaming was commonplace. Pagan families thought you had joined a harmful cult. Jewish families thought you had abandoned the faith and become a blasphemer. And because Christianity was small and new, there was always reason to return to the easier, less stressful life of Judaism or paganism. And lastly, existential sacrifices. This is a crisis of personal identity and meaning. Who am I, and why does my life or anything matter? This was the crisis that the church needed to give an answer to. And it confessed boldly that the answer was, you are in Christ, you are a Christian. If Christianity ministered to the other challenges, on this one they spent the most time. Patristic writings share a general broad theme, penetrating most deeply into the mystery of Christ, that is, who he was and his nature. From the earliest Christians, we knew this, that whatever Christianity is, it is obsessed with Christ. There is no Christianity without Christ. So to enter the patristic period and read the Fathers is to desire to know Christ more. Christianity, after all, is supposed to be good news. It is supposed to have an answer to existential dread. Christians proclaim that God has come to earth to do a new thing, to break old ways and cycles. Christ literally reinscribes the world and human existence with new meaning. But with all this going on, debates, conflict, and emotional stress, why would anyone join the church And why did it grow in the first place? Well, theologically, we would say it grew because the Holy Spirit had good news to bring to those who would hear, and because Christians showed amazing care for their neighbors, critics, and persecutors. And it made non-Christians shocked and amazed. Some of the earliest things we know about Christians, not from Christian writings themselves, come from critics, like Pliny the Younger, a critic from the first century. He was a Roman governor in what is today Turkey. He comments that Christians were known in communities because of their weekly gatherings, where they held communion. Now, communion services were private at this time for baptized Christians only, so pagans couldn't see them. And rumors of their liturgy began to surface. Pliny was told that Christians were cannibals who eat bodies and drink blood and practice incest because they call each other brother and sister, and they practice love feasts, and they also refuse to worship the emperor. But Pliny also heard good things, and if other pagans were hearing similar things, then Christianity must have been seen as a major contradiction. Pliny writes to the Christians, quote, "They meet together on a fixed day before daybreak, to repeat in turn a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by an oath, not to commit adultery, not to break their word, and not to deny a loan when demanded." Pliny would go on to persecute Christians, but he gives us other vital bits of information, like how the church was demographically diverse. Many persons of every age, of every rank, of both sexes are daily involved in it. Although democratically diverse, socioeconomically, most Christians were poor. Another early Roman critic, Celsus, wrote in 178 AD, quote, "We see wool dressers, cobblers, and fullers, the more uneducated and common individuals, not daring to say a word in the presence of their masters who are older in age." Celsus was impressed, though, however, by Christian morality and the loyalty they showed to each other. He was somewhat surprised by their eloquence in teaching and preaching, commenting that when they get a hold of children in private, and silly women with them, they are wonderfully eloquent. But for Celsus, this eloquence was in a context. They were more eloquent than he expected, but in fact were, quote, "like frogs holding a discourse round a swamp, or worms in a conventicle in a corner of the mud." A Christian apologist named Athenagoras also claimed most Christians were poor. Quote, "With us you will find unlettered people, tradesmen and old women, who, though they are unable to express in words the advantages of our teaching, demonstrate by acts the value of their principles." Justin Martyr, a church father we'll spend more time with next lecture, wrote as early as 155 saying, quote, "We who loved wealth and possession, not put together even what we have and share it with all those who are in need." Indeed, the Christians did, in ways that never had happened before. Remember, this is a time period without any social programs or support. There's no social security, free or subsidized health care, no social welfare housing, no food stamps. Many people were left to just starve and die, especially widows, whose husbands often died fighting in Rome's wars. A later emperor of Rome, Julian, complained, quote, "Jews do not allow any of their own people to become beggars, and the Christians support not only their own, but also our poor." By 251, the church at Rome was supporting 1,500 widows and deeply impoverished people that we have on its widows' roll. In 252, in Carthage, a huge ancient city in North Africa that was part of the Roman Empire, was struck by a plague. And the bishop there, a church father named Cyprian, ordered his deacons to care for the sick. But there was more. Christian social customs developed. In one of the earliest extra-biblical writings in existence is a little worship guidebook called the Didache, translated the teaching. In it, Christians are required to lodge anyone who calls himself a Christian for up to 3 days free of charge. It also says that if the person tries to stay more than 3 days, you can have full assurance that they are not a Christian. Christians also buried their dead in cemeteries or catacombs, not something poor people could expect back then. Christians dressed modestly and caused little trouble, looked to make converts even to those who abused or persecuted them. Interestingly, perhaps, they were also purposefully not political. Christians rarely served in the army, one of the only, if not the only way, to have a chance at upward mobility in Rome. They avoided jobs in political administration or as magistrates. And this was because they did not want to come into contact with idolatry and the required sacrifices, and also because they did not want to have a hand in the system that condemned other Christians to death. So this refusal to be politically involved made the Romans even more suspicious of Christianity and whether or not it was truly supportive of Rome. Most Christian converts early on were women. And we know this from church records that we found and that exist today. Even Paul in the New Testament makes reference to a woman whose husband was not a believer. Most common were widow converts. Most women were girls when they married, and the common age was 13 or 14. But often they were married off to much older men. So usually the men died in battle or of old age, leaving a lot of young women as widows and without any social change or support. In Christianity, though, they found support, love, and hope. To give just one example, one church in North Africa was raided and its goods confiscated from church members. The surviving catalog lists 38 women's veils, 82 women's tunics, 47 pairs of women's slippers, but only 16 men's tunics. Also astonishing and controversial were slave conversions. When slaves and masters attended church together, once they were gathered together, they became brother and brother, or brother and sister sister, something unheard of and unimaginable at the time period. As one scholar has noted, quote, Christians accepted slavery as the eternal condition of man, but from Judaism's history of being slaves in Egypt, knew that God was an emancipator. So this was the setting and also the contradiction that Christianity was in the first century and in the few that followed. From the inside, debates over theology and morals ensued. There also was the matter of identity and the temptation to let other groups define what Christianity was. Christians faced emotional and physical temptations and harms. Conversion was costly. Christians were often misunderstood, and in some cases, they were even seen as being dangerous cannibals or incestuous perverts. But Christianity was also known for its love of neighbors, its good public morals, its care for the poor, sick, and abandoned. It was kind to those who were mean to it. It was generous and consistently took care of its own. In this contradiction, the Church Fathers lived and wrote. The remainder of the course will focus more on the interior life of the church, what Christians believed, how their practices shaped their life, and how the Fathers spoke into new challenges. But this context won't fully come to a close until Constantine becomes emperor and makes Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Before all that, the contradictions in Christianity make a target of persecution and violence on it. It is to this extremely formative period of time, Christian persecution, and the martyrs, that we'll turn to next.